lineup of experts in the field of business, government...
We're going to go along the panel, and the first question I really just want to get is each of the panel's perspective on this data and what does it mean from their perspective, anything that makes them excited, anything that scares them, any insights that you think you can bring to the panel today.
I think very quickly to respond to Ian's question, what from the presentation, what from the report I found especially insightful, especially helpful in both my roles in business and politics. Just very quickly, I think one of the key takeaways, the first key takeaway that you pointed out, peer-to-peer media, peer-to-peer influencing, is particularly important versus a top-down, old-style type of communications. I think that has implications both in the political world I operate in as well as in the business world I operate in. Now obviously in the political world, it's, in my mind, it's something that both the government and the opposition understand. It's something that, maybe understand is not right, but I think they appreciate a bit of the pattern, but they haven't necessarily figured out what's the best way to react to it. Now, very quickly, one example. So they have a sense that peer-to-peer influencing is most important, and therefore social media, digitized media is where you want to be at. But oftentimes I feel that the communication strategy remains traditional, remains conventional, and they don't fully appreciate the fact that you need, for the lack of a better word, a conduit. You need people, you need sort of megaphones which people themselves trust. And having authority figures populate the social media space, communicate in a way that's old and traditional, and the only thing that's different is that they're operating that in the social media. I think that's a current mistake that perhaps the political world doesn't fully grasp yet. So very quickly, that's one example. Second example on, I think, let me just move to the business side of things. One thing that I found quite helpful and perhaps a thought starter for me in my business world is really how we engage with our employees. So I run a mid-sized company, not very big, about 100 plus employees. And the idea that I have to now be more public and be more visible in demonstrating my views on societal issues, which obviously as a politician I do have. And previously I thought that it's best that I separate both worlds and try to remain professional and exhibit sort of like a Chinese wall between the two worlds. And maybe that's something that I want to re-evaluate now that I've come today.
I think the biggest insight from the survey has really been about the level of trust within organizations and consumers and organizations. And I'm a true believer of an informed public. I think we have the technology and we have sufficient platforms to make the public more informed. And clearly, what we lack as large corporates is we lack insights into the people we serve, such as the service industry or the people that we produce products for. And clearly that distrust or that level of trust that's being inflected now by the masses is because they're becoming more informed. I work for a large corporate. We used to talk at our consumers rather than talk to them. We didn't really understand our consumers. We didn't understand different segments. We didn't understand their needs. And clearly what's happening in the world now as consumers become more informed and they've got different platforms to receive that information, they're becoming a little bit more distrustful of how we speak to them and how we communicate to them. But it's a huge potential. A lot of what we've done in the last year is we've used tools and we've used data that we have as a company to try to understand better what our consumers want. And we learned that as we build a communication platform, a communication tool that talks to our customers about their needs and wants, there's a level of trust that we see in these customers because we're identifying with their needs rather than speaking to them. It's not always, there's always a conflict between short-term, like you mentioned, short-term profits and building this level of trust and building products and services that consumers can trust and rely on. But over time, as you become a very competitive environment where you will have low barriers of entry for people to enter your industry, that level of trust does give you a premium. That level of trust does give you the opportunity to sell products that clearly identify what consumers need. It's becoming very, very difficult to be transparent and accountable and at the same time drive your narrative because your narrative has to speak to many different types of people at the same time. And clearly understanding those different segments, clearly understanding those different types of people that you need to have a narrative to is really important. But I think the good thing is that we have the tools and we have the technology to better understand our consumers, and we should spend a lot more time working towards those needs. I think even more important than that, though, is the people that work within a company. I think for a long time we've been very hierarchical, we have very bureaucratic companies that have been built on the elite. And more I identify with the younger generation, the millennials and the Generation Ys, who are actually the influencers in the company. They understand our consumers better than we do as an elite. And to build an environment where these people can feel secure and trust means it has to be much more collaborative, it has to break down walls, you have to flatten structures. There is no point having 30 levels within an organization just to make the elite feel good about themselves. You've got to allow the people who are actually going to start influencing your business and us actually going to start identifying the consumers that you're selling, empower them a lot more, allow them to collaborate a lot more, and that's, to me, one of the most important things that this is showing, is that trust can only be built with the younger generation if you allow them to speak up and you allow them to collaborate and influence what we do in these companies.
Thanks. I think you're spot on. Allowing the millennial workforce to talk out on behalf of your company because they have a significant peer-to-peer influence will enable you to sell more. It will enable you to recommend people to work there. And so for a retention strategy of just allowing them to talk and tweet about a meeting, it's sort of bad ideas.
Hello. I've seen data from the Trust Barometer over the years. I think this year's data and findings are very scary. Scary in the sense that there's a divergence of levels of trust among the general population and the informed public. In my industry, media, I can suppose that the informed public who trust the media are trusting media outside Malaysia because they tell more. And the general public, maybe uninformed one, there's no access, no money to go to paywalls, don't trust the media because they see the dissonance between what comes out in media and the reality of life. Yeah, and those in authority, and Malaysia is very fortunate now. We have governments on both sides of the political aisle, state and federal government, and their performance over the last two elections will be assessed by the public, by the media in the coming elections. And if they are serious about still wanting to be government, it shouldn't be so political, but if they are serious about still wanting to be government, they would have to look through Edelman's Barometer, Trust Barometer over the last 5 years and see why, and try to figure out why people are losing their trust in government, to some extent media, to some extent NGOs, and more in businesses. A takeaway for me is that in Malaysia, people look towards businesses for education and training, access to education and training. And it's because there's a failure in our country, an education system that does not prepare us for the jobs available in Malaysia or the region. It's a huge debate in Malaysia now about foreign workers. I was in Penang over the weekend. My schoolmate, we've been schoolmates since we were 6 years old, he told me his factory floor has citizens from 5 countries and none from Malaysia because the Malaysians are not qualified. It just goes beyond what we see and the data that we have, but the reality on the ground is, even for me, it's hard to find Malaysians who are qualified, right? And we blame the government. So trust in government falls, and trust in businesses will go up in today and in the next few years. Unfortunately, Tansi Rafida isn't here. She's a great user of Facebook. A great user of social media is Dr. Sri Nazir. He uses Instagram and does very sly statements. And that tells you we are looking at them and following them because they are the leadership that we trust. Anyone in government will have to be very careful and fearful about this data because it just tells you the next elections and coming elections, people will look at professionals, maybe like Shariel himself, Dr. O, Dushan, for leadership and ideas. Right? Thank you.
So I just think a note of warning for business leaders looking to get into politics, please don't follow the Donald Trump school of engagement. you know, one of the interesting things, just as an aside on Mr. Trump, why we think he came about is there's a 25-point gap in America of what the informed think about the next 5 years to what the general think about it. So the general population, I think it's 1 in 4 have a positive view about the future, the rest have a negative future. In the informed, it completely flips. And because there's this gap in the elite, that's where, you know, the Trump effect is coming in. And to some extent, on the other side of the coin, Bernie Sanders is coming in as well. But their role in social media and using social media, Trump's strategy is say something offensive and disgusting, have the media report about it, and then take that agenda and use it as an opportunity to say something he wants to actually talk about. And it's a very powerful source, and I hope that the media in Malaysia, as they get into elections, doesn't fall into that trap. Dr. O.
Thank you. Looking at the divergence between the trust levels of the elites as well as I think it's the general population, the so-called less informed population, I'm very much struck by, I guess I would call it a forbearance or tolerance of the mass population towards a lot of what has been going on in the country for the past half a century or so. We are very blessed as a country. We're very blessed with a lot of natural resources and so on. So I guess that sort of cushions people's sort of misgivings towards the authorities, towards a lot of those who are in power and so on. And then nowadays, perhaps you see sort of for lack of a better word, a collusion of sort of a convergence of business and government. We have, for example, a lot of companies which are government controlled, and then so you have a group of elites who sort of, as was mentioned before, believe in themselves, whereas there's a huge group of people out there, a mass population who sort of somewhat seeing through this, and I emphasize the word somewhat, and are registering a high level of distrust. If we are not careful about this, as we move forward, a milder consequence would be, for example, the rise of populism, such as what was mentioned before, like similar to the United States with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and so on. And that's to the milder side. To the not so mild side, I mean, in terms of consequences of this, you would see, of course, the emergence of extremism, people radicalizing themselves because there's not much that they could do to better their future, the prospects for themselves, their family, for the country, and so on. So this high level of distrust among the mass population versus the high level of trust among the elite, I think it's a development which we really have to pay a lot of attention to. And then as a company, I think you're very lucky to have a lot of people trusting in businesses, trusting in companies as again, as the agent for change and so on. And companies should indeed not misplace or misuse this sort of trust from the general population. Companies should instead really treasure this level of high level of trust and try to, again, as suggested, to engage in certain, for example, socially responsible programs and so on, to combine social responsibility with the profit motive. I think that would be the takeaway for companies. I will stop at that first.
I'm just going to Rob. Obviously, it's one of your first experiences with the Edelman Trust Barometer. What are some of the things that you've found as you've gone through the process?
For me, I fell in love with Malaysia back in 1988 when I backpacked from Kuantan to Kota Bharu. And even from those early days of being here, and I've been a guest in the country this time for about 3.5 years. Resilience. You know, we don't ask a resilience question, but my takeout is, you know, as a people, Malaysians are remarkably resilient. The other kind of benchmarking that I find fascinating is what I call the happiness index, the happy chart. And you know, if you take the glass half empty perspective, it would be easy to point and say doom, gloom and despondency. But my genuine belief, having kind of poured through the data, as you know, is that the people of Malaysia are looking for optimism. They're looking for guiding lights, and they will accept it from whichever of the four institutions are prepared to step forward and provide it. But fundamentally, there's a lot of positivity that we can build on.
According to a press statement, I saw here you say that the trust in government feels 7 to 29%, and even worse to the informed public, which is 34%. So actually, what's the definition for the 39%? Is it fear? Is it terrible? Is it so? Okay, this is my first question, and then the second question is, the 39% means that it might be because of a series of the story that we know, which is why IDB or the 2.6 billion donation, so-called. Does it mean that if the government changed that, so our so-called trust in government points will be gained back?
What can I say? I'm a journalist like you. I asked this question myself. I think we are midterm to this administration by Najib Razak, and the survey done would tell you that they were affected by news of what happened in the last few years. But also, I think generally, this government going to elections in 2013 made a lot of promises. The economy was on a high then. The economy isn't that bad, but everyone's feeling the effects of it. Retrenchments in oil and gas, plantations only making money because it's in ringgit, and retail is suffering a bit of a sour note. So I think it reflects in their mood when you ask them a straightforward question, do you trust the government? Of course they'll say no. In Malaysia, I think trust in government is very simple. Ian said it, you know, turn on your lights, do your roads well. Instead, your minister's saying they will turn your already pothole roads into racetracks for motorcyclists, completely missing the point about what the government should be doing. In that sense, publicly I'm going to praise Dr. Sri Najib Razak because he survived 40 years, and with a cabinet like this, he's still Prime Minister. Amazing, isn't it? Thank you very much.
My only, I think, value add to this is, like Ian said, that the interpretation of the data was going to be necessarily speculative because questions were posed at that level. What I want to persuade people to consider is, if you look at, briefly when I saw the slides, on where the other countries were also in a neutral category re-government, what kind of drivers would explain that kind of score for them? What kind of drivers would explain the UK's lack of trust in government? What kind of drivers would explain the lack of trust in the US government, among the US people? And therefore, my point is, I think it's country specific. It is perhaps useful to consider that as a democracy matures, as a country matures, the cynicism levels of people against the government or of the government is just going to go up. And regardless of how the government communicates, regardless of how the government performs and how the economy performs, people put less trust on politicians, people put less trust on the government. And they tend to see NGOs, they tend to see the third party, whatever third party is, to be something that's more attractive, something that's more appealing to them. Having said that, it doesn't mean government communications can't be better. Going back to your question here, what can government do to improve its trust rating? I think in general, the appearance of being transparent is very important. I think that's the same across the other institutions as well. So there's no reason to feel that government is in any way different in this. It's how confident are people that when government says something, they mean it, when government communicates something, they are sincere, and that's something that I think any political party will need to address.
I really think the scores that you see in Malaysia, you see the UK and the US are similar. It's also the fact that Malaysia is becoming more informed population. Malaysia is getting access to information. Information isn't asymmetrical like it used to be. In any country where you have a population that's becoming more informed, more interested in what's happening around the country, there will always be skepticism. There will always be, you always have to manage perception. And I think what Sharon said about, just like in corporates, as your consumers have peer reviews, as your consumers get more information, you have to be transparent and you have to be accountable. It's not always the right message, but the honest message, the true message, works a lot better than actually trying to keep things away from the public. Because there is enough sources of information out there that you won't be able to keep the public away from that informed decision. And managing perception becomes, and from large corporates, maybe to a certain extent, the government, we're behind the curve on that. We're behind the curve on the immediacy of the information, the transparency and the accountability, and how we get that information out to our consumers, also the public at large. I think it's really important.
I think it may make you wonder, even though there's a series of, shall we say, disturbing events and so on, but people's trust in government, as in the survey, is still very high, right? I think the main reason for that is people implicitly make a distinction between, on the one hand, politicians who are perhaps sort of like actors on stage, and on the other hand, this institution of government, quote unquote, who is more and more perceived as a service provider. I think if you specifically ask people on their trust on politicians, you may get a slightly different result. But if you just say government, I think a lot of people perceive it as, for example, if you go to the I think now it's called Urban Transformation Center, all these UTCs, to change your passport and your ICs and so on, you can get it done in 1-2 hours. So people perceive that as government, as service providers. So I think in future, if the government would like to sort of make itself more popular, it has to sort of institutionalize this, at least perception, if not practice, as being a service provider, to sort of technocratize itself as service providers. As an enlarged version of these UTCs, these providers of conveniences and so on.
What do you think, working within that broad industry of technology, and it's a massive industry and everyone tries to catch themselves, what are some of the things that you think technology is doing right? Why does that halo exist? How do you have to think about keeping ahead of the halo or keeping ahead of that trust curve when you're in the technology space?
So I think we need to start by defining what technology companies are. Everyone calls themselves a technology company at the moment, and to a certain extent I would even debate whether Maxis is still a technology company. It's a utility company, I'm not sure it's a technology company anymore. I think the paramount value add that's coming out of technology companies they are providing services that are more efficient, more effective, more seamless, and definitely more convenient. And the companies that are being identified as technology companies are these companies like Apple, companies like Samsung, companies like Uber. The traditional companies that used to be called technology companies, and you go down to any financial regulator forum, all they talk about is fintech, because they believe that banks are becoming technology companies and they're using technology to improve their consumers' everyday life. I feel that as a telecommunications company, the first thing I need to identify with is the fact that I'm not a technology company. I'm an enabler of technology, and most of that technology is actually coming through digital platforms. Where digital platforms are giving consumers more choice and better services is where legacy companies like Maxis have to identify their position within the space and clearly provide a better enabling platform than trying to be a technology company. A lot of trust now, in companies like Uber, in companies like TripAdvisor, the reason it works is because the reviews are peer-to-peer. It's not a large company telling you this is the best product. You actually get to listen to people like yourself commenting and reviewing a specific product. And actually, when you talk about that, the segregation because of this, because of peer-to-peer and social media, is becoming more apparent. One of the charts that you had said that actually one of the key influences are people like you. Now, if you look at Facebook, if you look at TripAdvisor, you identify with people like you to see what they say about a specific product or a service. You might not listen to necessarily a CEO tell you, but if it's a person who lives in the same demographic range as you do and just has the same likes, the influence that he would have over you, she would have over you is much, much, much greater. And so as a community, we are actually becoming more segmentized and more segregated. And we need to listen to these peers to believe in the products and services that we have. And technology allows that to happen because technology does two things. One, it allows you to take these insights, they take these deep data and identify with consumers that are similar, and then to communicate to them effectively so that they share these messages and they promote your products and services. And more companies have to move away from traditional, megaphone-like announcements or communication to identify with the right type of consumer for the right product and ensure that he shares it because the narrative is the one that he wants to hear. So I think technology companies are all about smaller communities identifying with services and products that they like, rather than these large behemoths that, like us, who enable the technology rather than being technology companies.
Is there a risk? Ian in during his presentation talked about potentially the blind leading the blind. Is there a risk that we're building societies, online especially, where everything is being created in our own self-image, and we create these walled gardens where we start to believe our own bullshit? We're drinking from the same Kool-Aid fountain, effectively, and I'd love to get others' views on that, because it may be very satisfying, but if you're looking to communicate out to the mass market and bridge that gap in trust, it's adding an extra barrier to how you might do that. I'd love to hear people's views.
So I just have one. I don't think there is a mass market anymore. And I think companies that believe one message, one tone, and one narrative works across an entire population might find that they will lose touch with that particular population. I think everything that we do now as a company has to be based on an insight and data that you have to identify that the customer you're talking to and ensure that the narrative, the message is direct and actually adds value to them. Mass marketing, for me, was lost 2 years ago and continuously declined, and we've got to be much more specific in our narrative and our message to
I think, a lot of people drink their own Kool-Aid and their own walled garden, but if you look at the data just now, a fair number of people, a higher number of people actually go to search engines. They are looking for contrarian views. They don't actually trust what they see, whether it's peer-to-peer reviews in Amazon or Uber or Grab Taxi and all that. So people are looking for alternatives and contrarian views before they make up their mind. So I think we haven't reached a stage where everyone's thinking on the same pond. I think most people are a lot more inquisitive now, and they want to get a better deal or a better laptop, and they would actually do a lot of research before committing to something.
I think number one, it's sort of a guerrilla warfare out there in the cyberspace. On the one hand, of course, people are trying to get the best of deals by reading through a lot of comments and so on. On the other hand, it's also, I think, well known that certain companies, they will have campaigns to pay certain online activists to write something quite nice about themselves or something not so nice about the competitors. So people are also, so I think one of the main reasons people have these walled gardens is so that they could sort of outwit this sort of people who are trying to put out news or analysis which are not so accurate. So they sort of build a circle of trusted confidants around themselves who can give them trusted ideas, trusted recommendations on hotels and other services, flights and so on. But I would also like to add another point. Namely, I think sometimes people appreciate, you see, as technology moves forward, in a company such as yours, as technology moves forward, for example, if I have a plan, if I have your Maxis plan, which previously would give me, let's say, 1 gig per month for a certain amount, And now because of technology and so on, and advances in technology, you could offer like 10 gigs for the same amount of money or even less. I think you should take a proactive step in informing me. I mean, nothing would make me feel more, happier than you telling me with the same amount that I'm paying, now I can actually get 10 gigs instead of 1 gig. And I would, of course, then spread the words around saying this is a company which cares about its customers and so on.
The paradox of social media. Social media incentivizes you to have reach, right? So you're judged by how many followers you have, how many page likes you have. But at the same time, to Sean's point, which I think is completely valid, this idea of mass marketing, mass messaging is over. It's about targeted communications. So how do you target communications in a world where your platforms, even though they are digitized, even though they're social, they tend to incentivize a large audience. So that's a problem that I don't know if businesses and government has yet to crack. So I think that's one thing to keep in the back of our mind. How do we have that reach, but at the same time target our narrative differently? And second point, second angle I want to come in at is Robert's point about whether we drink our Kool-Aid. This I think there's a relation to that in the first point. Because as you build this reach, as you desire to build this reach, and as you then target your narrative differently, there is a risk, perhaps more pronounced than at any time in mankind's history, that you lose yourself. And politicians face that risk all the time, at least the ones with conscience. Business leaders might also face that risk all the time. But I think in this day and age, when you're constantly trying to tailor stuff, it's a challenge that maybe the public don't fully appreciate. How do people stay true to themselves, have a core message that doesn't change despite the different channels through which you communicate, but at the same time still be relevant to the different audiences you communicate? So those are the two problems that I think we need to start thinking about.
I would like to ask, the data states that the most sourced media is the least trusted media, but at the same time, the media is still playing a significant role in shaping foreign perspectives on Malaysia. How does it affect the level of trust from foreign investors today?
I think foreign investors don't look at social media. Foreign investors look at government, look at investment bankers, academics, they look at all kinds of reports before they decide whether they want to invest in Malaysia. And today when we talk about social media, it's a very interesting word, phrase actually, social media. What is it? Is it your Facebook? Is it your Twitter? Is it your WhatsApp? I don't know. People share a lot of things. That's why it's most trusted among your peers and least trusted because you don't know where the source of information is. Has it been verified? Is it true? There are websites like Snopes that tell you whether that piece of information is true or not. For example, we're coming to 2 years of MH370. There's a report recently that the pilot was actually in Taiwan recovering in a hospital. Not true. So, foreign investors come to Malaysia, they speak to people like you from MDEC, they speak to government, they speak to MIDA, they speak to a lot of people before they decide whether they want to invest in Malaysia. And of course, today they'll read Financial Times, New York Times, which is spending a lot of coverage on Malaysia, so then they can make up their mind. Personally, I think Malaysia is a great place to invest. Beautiful country, not much natural disasters, maybe a few politicians, but otherwise it's a great country. Thank you.
My question is to do with the high level of trust for the NGOs. And is it unusual when compared to the other countries in the world? And may I ask the panelists, why do they think that the NGOs of all the 4 institutions, they share the highest level of trust?
So NGOs are the most trusted institution all around the world, and they have been for a long time. The only place where they're struggling is Japan. And Japan, the issue in Japan was that post-Fukushima, there was 2 things in Japan. The public within Japan is sick of international NGOs criticising Japan's policies around, say, labor, and they feel like they're being attacked. And then on the other hand, and there are very local specific NGOs that were involved in the rehabilitation efforts, and there was some corruption and environmental issues. Broadly, the Edelman House view on why NGOs remain as the most trusted institutions because they get up every day, try to make the world a better place, and they help, they fix some individual's personal problem, they campaign on an issue that we should, when we look at it, most of us should care about. So they come from a source of purpose, well before profit, and they come from an environment where the rest of the world is looking for the rest of the institutions to come from that same space. Where they're beginning to fall down now is just the increasing commercialisation operations of those organisations to enable them to deal with the challenges that are faced in front of them. The other thing about NGOs is it's quite similar to the institutional definition. Many of us, it might be a local community organisation, a charity we engage with. For others, we might define it as our relationship to Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. Again, a very personal definition, but they do come from a space of heart, really.
I think agree with everything he said. NGOs, I believe, my point of view is they're largely inoffensive, right? So you don't define them as an institution or organization for money. Neither are they institutions or organizations that are for power, right? So because of the inoffensive nature and the brand is a lot more, I think, easier to sell. The only, not to burst the bubble, but the only thing that I point out and I hope the public can be informed about is over time NGOs are seen as neutral, independent, all the rest of it. But if you look at the funding sources, it's not always as easy and straightforward. So that's something that perhaps over time the public will, in Malaysia at least, will learn to appreciate, and that might adjust or correct some of these gaps or differences in the sector.
How do you distinguish among the non-profit organizations who are out on altruistic mission to help, and aid, the less fortunate around the world? Because there is a perception that, sometimes when you're donating such amount of money and it doesn't go through to the people who actually need it.
So the questions around the performance of charitable donations and trust around that. The good thing is that most people trust and hope that the money that you put into these organisations will hit the ground. The reality is that those organisations just now need to start to be aware, which I said, their transparency and their ability to deliver the services of which they've promised based on the money. Does anyone else have a perspective on that?
I really think it comes down to transparency and accountability. And sometimes this blurred lines between commercial aspects of an NGO and more consistent NGO and its true purpose is sometimes a little blurred as well. And again, it's about because the public becomes more and more informed about how these people invest and what they're investing in there. And as Cheryl said, their funding sources, there's a bit more skepticism towards these NGOs. But I think, again, going back to the purpose, why do NGOs have so much trust? Is because of their pureness of purpose. They basically wake up every morning fighting against what we call the elite or the lobbying power for the masses. And that clearly helps them drive their message much more strongly than the corporate can. When we do campaigns to help CSR campaigns, we always work with an NGO because the acceptance level is always much higher than if a big company like Maxim used to go out and build houses for orang asli and things like that. They have a sense of purpose, they have a brand that works towards that, and I think it continues to do so very strongly. I think that there's more of a purpose in NGOs now than there's ever been because of this need to take the public's opinion out into the open.